Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie. So a question that someone in the office actually suggested, one of the editors, specifically to Julie, what inspired this anthology specifically?
Good question. What inspired this anthology specifically? Well, full disclosure, it wasn't my idea. Though, going further back than that, when I was about 19 and the internet was kind of brand new, I heard that you could create these things called web pages or websites. Didn't know what that meant. And my idea was to start posting a poem a day, poems that I liked, and a little blurb about why I liked them, but mostly just to sort of showcase that poem. Then I realized I had no idea how to create a website, and nor did I even know what it meant to create a website. And to this day, I still don't know how that relates to the servers that they sit on or anything like that. So all around, poetry website wasn't obviously for me. But I never stopped loving poetry, and I never stopped sharing it with other people, whether they wanted me to or not. I hope most wanted me to. But so when I was approached with the idea of creating a poetry anthology that's with a sole purpose of bringing some brightness and joy and comfort and inspiring resilience and courage in other people, I of course jumped at the chance and created a kind of proposal that in one sense felt kind of selfish, because it was all the poems that I loved. And then I had to sort of weed through those because there were far too many, and think about which ones would have a greater resonance. And of course, not all poems will speak to all people. But I still tried to collect a cross section of poetry from diverse eras, diverse races, sexes, cultures. I only have one poem that was originally written in another language, and that is Issa's haiku, which of course would have been in Japanese. If we do a follow-up anthology, I might consider more poetry in translation as well. But so it was born in somebody else's mind, and then I was given the great gift of the great privilege of collecting that poetry and sharing it with others.
Did you find that you really, sorry, Fizza, did you really enjoy putting it together? Was it a great pleasure to do?
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, it absolutely was. I mean, this could have been my full-time life work. I had to remember that I had another job, or in fact, two jobs and hobbies, because all I wanted to do was sit and read poetry. And it started coming together last November, and I am in Canada. At the time I was in Ontario, now I'm in New Brunswick, which is further east and even colder. But it was getting into these dark, cold, wintry nights, and I just got to sit in it's a beautiful soft chair who I've named Sybil, from Oscar Wilde's the Picture of Dorian Gray, and I got to sit there and just read poems and fold pages over that I wanted to go back to. So it was a pure delight. And then going back to me, saying it was sort of a selfish project, and then remembering it wasn't for me, that too was beautiful, because in remembering that this needed to have a wider audience, I was given the opportunity to think out about what situation we're in right now. We're all in together, a pandemic that's devastating, in an age of increased hate crimes, raging wildfires. The world is hurting. And I got to think about how this art could bring some hope and lightness to, and if not lightness, always comfort, or a sense of togetherness to other people. So I wasn't so alone in my room in a cold, wintry Canadian season, just reading it for myself, but it started connecting me with others before they even had a chance to see the book. But I'd love to turn that question to you, because of course you too have created poetry anthologies, and you write your own poetry. What has your experience been selecting poems for yourself and for other people?
Well, yeah, I think it happened to me it felt almost presumptuous to imagine that I might ever put an anthology together. But like you, a publisher approached me to put something together, and they paid me, and it felt like an extraordinary privilege and a self-indulgent thing to do. But I was doing a slightly odd project called Emergency Poet, where I was driving a vintage ambulance to festivals and dressed up as a doctor. It's completely crazy, doing poetry or prescription. And the book came from that work. So I'd already got the poems together. I was already using them. They were kind of tried and tested out in the real world. So it was already there, actually. But it was a wonderful thing. And I really like your anthology. I love the way you've put it in, even though it's poems of hope for dark days. It's also divided into sort of more subtle subsections. I wonder if you can talk about how you did that.
Sure, thank you. And I just have to say, I read about the Emergency Poet, how long? I mean, it must have been 8 or 10 years ago in The Guardian, maybe longer. But I was I was immediately drawn to the idea because, of course, I too am so dedicated to thinking about poetry as healing. I also have spent many years teaching poetry in university classrooms, which is a whole other experience. But anyway, all that to say, I've been an admirer of the concept of the emergency poet for a very long time. But in terms of how I chose the sections for my anthology, some of them were suggested to me by the original, by the publisher. Things like joy, for example, nature. I can't remember now which ones were suggested and which ones I added. It was a really lovely conversation. But I guess, again, because I feel I'm so aware of the fact that I might love a poem that somebody else can't resonate with, or vice versa, I realized that to focus just on, say, happiness, or just on nature as an escape wouldn't be broad enough. Mm-hmm. I think our emotional landscapes are each so unique that we need to, in an anthology, think about what other people might need, just as you do with your poetry pharmacy. You're not going to give somebody an E.E. Cummings poem who really needs a poem by, I don't know, Joy Harjo or somebody. You have a sense of what they might need. So because I don't have the privilege of having just an individual come to me and say, I'm feeling very anxious about the way that my marriage is unfolding currently, I can't say, oh, good, here's a poem for you. I wanted to make sure that anybody who came to the book would find something in it that gave them what they needed. Maybe they don't need joy on this day. Maybe they need courage on this day. Yeah. Maybe they don't love cities and they're trapped in one. Or maybe they don't love rural Canada. It's like, and I'm trapped in one. So what might each of us need? And I would never presume to fully understand what somebody else might need. But I hope that I've covered enough bases within these different sections to ensure that everybody finds something there. And perhaps that's where the title, we need to be a little bit sort of elastic with our understanding of this title, Bright Poems, because I would actually call some of the poems contemplative. Some might even be sad. I don't think that any are heartbreaking. I think even the sad ones, I've chosen them with the hope that they will comfort people, that they will remember that they are not alone in their own heartache. Doesn't mean that their heartache isn't individual and horrible, but there is somebody who has been there before, and so I was also moving the sections into things that were a little bit more contemplative, in the hope that in case they didn't need, in case over happy didn't grab them, something more comforting might.
Yeah, but they're bright in the sense that they shine a light, or even if it's a light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah.
Thank you. And to add to that, and then I want to sort of turn the question to you, but just a little bit differently. I think one of the things that makes this book really lovely, and I absolutely cannot take credit for it at all, is the illustrations in it. I like the front, and in fact, I love the front, and I've had lots of people write me and say, what an amazing cover. And then I've immediately said that is by the very talented Carolyn Gavin, who also is Canadian, just by chance. We're not, there aren't many of us. How two of us ended up in this anthology, I don't know. But I'm just randomly opening to another page. I forget how many illustrations are in here, 40 or something. And Carolyn has been she was so good at hitting something emotional in the piece, drawing it out and turning it into an illustration, that I think this is something that does make it stand out. But turning that question back to you, Deborah, because your approach, especially as an emergency poet, I mean, you have to improvise all the time. Somebody comes in and says, I'm X or I'm Y or I'm Z, or they're feeling something that maybe you've never felt or didn't even know was a feeling. How do you decide what to prescribe these individuals?
Yeah, well, they used to lie down on a stretcher actually inside the ambulance, and now I have a Victorian bookshop and a cafe. It's behind me here in Shropshire, and I have a velvet chaise longue, and they lie down on that. And it's a kind of pastiche of a kind of psychotherapy session. But I spend some time with them. I ask them lots of questions. I ask them about their reading habits, how they relax, get to know them a little bit. But asking about their reading habits means that I have a sense of what kind of text I need to share with them, whether it's something more contemporary or accessible or something more subtle, maybe. And yeah, I have hundreds of poems, and I print them out as a prescription and tell them to take it with a glass of wine or a cup of tea or whatever. And it's both a light thing, but the poetry is good quality, serious. It has a kind of a serious heart underneath the apparently lightness of it, I suppose. It's quite an odd thing to do, I think.
But it just sounds on top of everything else like fun, but also an achievement for somebody to walk through that door and say to you, who's a stranger, I need help. What words can help me? What sounds and images can buy me some time, can soothe me? And I think that what courage that must take.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's an odd thing. I think with an ambulance at a literary festival or at a school or library, and I don't know if it's true of British people in particular, but there's something, it's kind of akin to a kind of gypsy fortune teller setup, where people know that the magic may not be real, but they may hear some truth, or they may hear something that they need to hear. And I think there's something about people that will just have a go at it, and they're quite open-minded. So I'm not sure necessarily that they come with their heart first. I think they come open-minded. I think the ambulance, the chaise longue, the idea of poetry pharmacy signals that it's not going to be too intense. It's not going to be heavy or serious. I'm not going to ask them intimate. Well, they're intimate questions, but they're not invasive. And yeah, it has had quite a lot of media attention. I mean, you said you'd read something, I think, in the Guardian, and so I think people know more or less what to expect when they come in. But yeah, it's extraordinary, because I don't talk about their problem. I talk about the best of them, and when they have been at their best. And the poem and the problem are right at the end.
I love that idea of making it unintimidating, and it ties nicely into a question I'm seeing in the chat here about when you were choosing your poems, who did you imagine your audience would be? Because I think my response to that ties quite nicely into your approach to the emergency poet, or the poetry pharmacy, where so turning it back to my anthology and how I chose these poems and what audience I envisioned. Having taught poetry in university for so long, you get the odd shining star who says, I love poetry, and you can talk about it for hours. But most of my students, and bless them, because I might have been the same at their age don't have a lot to say. Or, I so often just heard, I hate poetry. Or I often ask at the beginning of a class, who likes poetry? And there's, 2 or 3 brave souls that put up their hand. And everybody else sits there and you're not sure if they're even awake or not. So I have always tried to make poetry less elite. I do absolutely believe there's a place in the university classroom and in academia beyond the university classroom to dissect poetry. Great poetry is often great and lasting because of the technical astuteness of the poet. So I don't want to discredit any of that, but I do think poetry can have such a broad reach. And going back to my little story about loving poetry since I was 4, you don't have to be a genius. You don't even have to know a single thing about English literature. I don't think you even have to understand English to hear a poem and have it bring you to your knees. I listen to poems in Italian. I can't say anything in Italian except pizza, and I probably didn't even say that right. and yet the sound of it that will move me. The passion of the poet or the reader reciting it will calm me. So when I thought about who my audience was, I wanted to make sure that anybody who was having a rough day, or who was feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders, or the weight of their own personal lives on their shoulders, could open this and find something meaningful to them. There are some poems that I sort of read about 100 times to make sure I could find something that really made sense. So it's not that they're all simple poems. They're not all limericks. In fact, there are no limericks. But all of them, most of them, or many of them, I think will be accessible to many, many people for one reason or another. And for anyone listening here, and I've put this in the anthology as well, it's not important that you understand everything, that you get every line of every poem. What matters is, as you read it, is it making you feel different? Is it making you feel better? Is it slowing your breath down? Is it slowing your heart rate? Is it making you feel less alone? Is it painting a picture that moves you or inspires you? Those are the things that I held in my mind as those are the criteria that I had as I chose these poems. So age, education, I think any age. I think some of these poems could be read by caregivers to children, and if the children don't fully get the poem, they'll love the picture that goes with it. Level of education. I mean, I have a PhD in English literature, and the poems move me. I don't think you have to have a PhD in English literature. It might even hurt because we might get too stuck thinking about, oh, why did that meter change at that point or whatever. But you don't have to do that. You just have to read them, preferably out loud. Even maybe not if you're on the bus or in the train, and feel them in your heart. And I guess that's a good question for you too, Deborah. As people come in, who comes in? Who's your average? Do you call them patients?
I do. Yeah. Well, it depends. When I was traveling around, I was often working in city centres, and you know what, there was no average person that came in. You know, people would wander up and say, what's going on here? And you know, I would invite them in, and so children, right, I have had everybody. I've worked I don't know, libraries and schools and NHS conferences and really odd places. So there is no average. I think what happens here in the Poetry Pharmacy, it's a real odd place here. We're on the English-Welsh borders, in the middle of nowhere in the countryside. And what happens now is people go out of their way to travel here and have some coffee and cake and talk about poetry or engage in writing workshops and around well-being. But we've only been here for 2 years, so the last 18 months has been quite odd for various reasons, as you can imagine. So we haven't been running the thing properly, but it's the people. It's not just local people. People come from all over the place to come and have a look at the poetry pharmacy and see what we're up to. But yeah, I've had a man walk in after he just registered the death of his wife, or and in terrible and deep grief, just wanting to talk to somebody. People who talk about decisions that they have trouble making, whether they should live in the town or the city, or they're stressed with the everyday living, modern living, and paying a mortgage and a job that they don't like, and all sorts of things in between.
Do you ever get any resistance or negativity about the concept or what you've prescribed?
No, actually, when I started this, it was I thought I would work at one poetry festival, and I had no idea if it would work really. And I was amazed by how people always love it. But I think it's a lot to do with the fact that they have their feet up, they are given really good attention, and I ask questions that they enjoy answering. So the process, grandly called process itself, is a pleasurable one. And then at the end of it, there's a gift of a poem, and it does no harm, So there's never. People always love it, actually, which really surprised me. I think there may be. You work in academia, and I used to teach at Keele University. I'm too busy now with the poetry pharmacy, but I think in English departments there can be some maybe a little snobbery around this playfulness with poetry. I'm having some fun with it, and I think, it's that very attitude, isn't it, that can put people off poetry, that they want to hold on to it for themselves. So do you have any of that response in your university?
No, in fact, I feel very lucky, because I do appreciate that sort of sense of elitism. But the department I work in now is that it's called the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health, and it's looking specifically at health inequities in the Canadian healthcare system, and those gaps in healthcare between Indigenous and non-Indigenous patients, and also considering a lot of burnout in healthcare professionals, many of whom are Indigenous. So while the focus is on Indigenous health, and this is very scientific, the approach in the Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health is actually very open to using arts and humanities to offset different health challenges within the healthcare system. So we often use poetry and visual imagery in the work that we do to address different challenges within the healthcare system. So I feel very lucky that the department that I'm in, and perhaps it's because it's not strictly English literature, we just happen to have some people that believe in the power of arts and humanities. I feel lucky that it's so receptive to the idea, and I love that we're using it in a sort of an applied way. So it does what you're doing as an emergency poet, what you've done with your own poetry and with your own anthologies, and with what I'm hoping to do with mine, is to bring poetry to a wider group of people to help heal themselves, but also to make them more empathetic and understanding people, so that they can help heal others. There's this huge understanding in arts and humanities that without arts and humanities, we can't put ourselves in other people's shoes in the same way. Of course, there would be resistance to that theory as well. But so luckily, I'm in an academic environment that believes in the power of art to effect change in the human spirit. And I'm so glad about that. And what I'm also glad about is that, being the department that I am, we get to showcase a lot of art by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Indigenous artists. and thereby try to bring more breadth to what has been a quite elitist canon. And I try to do that in my anthology as well. There are poems by Indigenous peoples who are living or have lived in Canada to expose a readership to some poetry that they might not have even been aware existed. But of course, Indigenous peoples have been here a long time. They're Indigenous to these lands. And so they've been creating stories and art for literally 10 or 20,000 years. So I feel like it's a privilege to have some of that in my anthology as well. So luckily I'm in a non-elitist environment, and it gives me an opportunity to do, I think, what you're doing with your poetry and your prescriptions as well, is to de-snobify literature and give it a broader sort of stage. And like you, with people coming in and just wanting to talk and willingly doing that, and having that sort of range of individuals interested in poetry, this is where I think a lot of university departments have it wrong. So many people would respond to poetry if we approached it differently. And nowhere did I see that more evidence than when I lived quite recently on this tiny island in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Eastern Canada, called Cape Breton Island, that almost even some Canadians haven't heard of. It's economically depleted. It's a very isolated island where a lot of individuals have had families living there for generations. So not a lot of exposure to, all the elite forms of art, not a lot of exposure to generations of education. And I started hosting these Reading for Wellbeing workshops in a variety of locations for a variety of types of individuals. And people were coming out of nowhere. People you would have never guessed would have been interested in poetry, that came and said, I want to do this, or would share with me a poem that had moved them or saved them or whatever, or would write their own poems and bring them to me and say, look at what I've created. And the need, the hunger for art was really humbling, actually. I've been so lucky to have spent the time that I have studying literature, and to have individuals come and teach me about poems, expose me to poems and ideas and ways in which literature can be healing, demonstrates that we have a skewed perspective of who understands art and who doesn't. Yeah. And I'm sure you have that happen all the time. People come in to the poetry pharmacy and expose you to ideas that perhaps you'd never thought of in the poems that you're prescribing. Is that the case? Do they teach you?
Oh yeah, people say this helped me, and it's a reciprocal thing. And I'm like a magpie. I collect them all the time. I'm looking for new words, but it's extraordinary that you were able to do that. And I like the way you talked about it as an applied art, and so often I think with other arts, everybody has an opinion. We stand in front of a movie or a picture or a painting, or and we have an opinion. Everybody's allowed to have an opinion. I think quite often with poetry, people feel that it's not for them. So to share it in that way is a wonderful thing. Absolutely. So why poetry in particular for you? What is it about poetry rather than prose?
Well, part of it, and this sounds quite shallow perhaps, but part of it is its brevity. Yeah. I mean, there are some wonderful long poems. I love The Fairy Queen. I love Paradise Lost. But the short ones you can memorize. You can say them as a mantra. They, in a very quick amount of time, a very short space of time, can rejuvenate. They're a verbal painting, yeah. And also the words themselves can inspire, of course, illustrations like Carolyn Gavin has done in my book. I love the characterization of novels. I love watching a character unfold over the course of, say, 300 pages or whatever. So I love novels, and full disclosure, my background is actually in theater, in drama, in Shakespearean drama and Jacobean tragedy. So I actually believe in the power of all those forms to help people become better versions of themselves, healthier, happier, and more empathetic versions of themselves. But poetry is really useful in, say, workshop settings, or while you're sitting on an airplane or whatever, because it's so quick, because it's so short, because it packs so much emotion and experience into a few lines, and because it's so rich in descriptive imagery that it becomes, you don't need 300 pages to finally walk in that character's shoes. You only need 14 lines, and all of a sudden you're there with them, experiencing their love or their joy or their pain or their healing or whatever the thing is.
Yeah, and really easy to share. Here it is. Here's the whole thing.
Exactly.
Exactly. Which is what we're both doing, isn't it? We're sharing it.
And it's such a joy for me, and I'm sure for you, to be able to do that. These little pieces that you just hand to somebody and say, this might and can and will make you feel better.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, you guys. That was really great to hear you guys talk so beautifully about poetry. It's something that I've never really gotten into, so I may change that up a little bit. Can I ask you both, is there a poem or a poet that you wish more people knew about?
Deborah, do you want to go first?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I love finding obscure poets and sort of bringing them forwards. I'm really particularly interested in American poets at the moment, but there are just so many. I've got so many there. There's a poet, Danusha Lemaris. Have you come across her? I think she's pretty well known in the States, but not so much in this country. And she wrote a poem called Small Kindnesses, which is a poem I love. There's just so many that I've got so many friends that are poets who I love. There's poet Bryony Little Fair, and she wrote a poem about happiness again, which I share quite a lot, and it's called Giraffe, bizarrely, and it's a wonderful poem. But yeah,
I've jotted them down so I can.
Yeah. I could go on. You can find both of them online, actually, both of those poems. But yeah, I have a long list, so I won't go on. How about you, Julie?
I mean, like you, I barely know where to start, but a poet that for at least 2 decades, if not more, has resonated with me, and in fact, I think has helped me be a better person, both more empathetic and also stronger myself, is Denise Levertov. She was born in Britain, but became an American citizen. She was a political activist, especially during the Vietnam War, so I appreciate her spirit. But she also wrote a lot about what it means to be human, and how divided our very selves can be. And I remember once, probably 20 years ago, saying to one of my very best friends, I was starting with a new therapist, unfortunately not a poetry pharmacist, but a counselor. I said, I don't even know where to begin telling her what's wrong with me. And my friend, Katie, said, just hand her that poem by Denise Levertov called In Mind, and tell her that's your problem. And or that's your challenge. And it's true. Denise Levertov is able to capture in just a handful of lines all of the complexities of being human, the things that we love about ourselves and hate about ourselves, the things that we torment ourselves with in terms of thoughts. And she uses that poetry to express and explore those emotions. And so when I read her poems, I've got Of Being, which is one of my favorite poems by Denise Levertov in this anthology. When I read her poems, I think that's it. That's me. That's how I feel. And those poems that aren't me and aren't how I feel, some of her protest pieces, about the Vietnam War make me want to stand up and fight for people's rights too, and cry out for peace and not give up. So she is both healing and inspiring.
Yeah.
I love so I guess too. Is she my favorite poet? One of them. She's one of them.
Yeah,
for sure.
And mine. I love her as well.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. I also have written down a lot of things that you've both said. And I'm going to definitely try and pop into the poetry pharmacy at some point. Definitely. Whenever I'm on that border between England and Wales, I'm popping in.
Good.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And to Julie and Deborah, I'm really sorry about the technical delays. Next time, hopefully, we won't face these problems again. We do have to wind down. So if there's anything that anyone wants to ask, if there's anything that Julie or Deborah really want to ask of each other, now is time. I see everyone leaving in my office. I'm just a little bit worried that I'm going to get locked in. Yeah, please fire away, anything.
I do see just one question in the comments here about a further anthology and what might be the theme or subject. And so I'll answer that. And thank you for the question. I think what Deborah and I have tried to demonstrate today, or have naturally demonstrated, is that poetry is so broadly applicable, and there's so many reasons that it's worth reading, that I think what I'd like to do with a follow-up anthology, if that ends up coming to pass, is a completely different kind of poetry that people can experience in a different way. So an idea I have in my mind is to create kind of dark, moody, an anthology of dark and moody stuff that could be read by candlelight, the kind of poetic version of ghost stories that might, here in Canada, as we're moving towards, I know it's only just autumn, but it feels like winter already. The idea of lighting a fire and pouring a glass of wine, lighting a few candles, listening to the storm outside, and reading something kind of dark inside, I think, to get us through some of those long winter nights. So that's an idea I have brewing in my mind.
So from bright to dark.
Bright to dark, yeah. And then to bright again, of course. The sun always rises in the morning.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Amazing idea. Again, thank you very, very much, everyone, for joining, and to Deborah and Julie. This has been a wonderful education in many, many ways. And I hope to see both of you soon, and see everyone in all the participants soon at some point. Let's aim to do something in the future. Again, thank you very much, everyone. I've been recording, which is why I had to switch everyone's video off. I'm just going to stop that right